mentioned the previous administration, the stagnant growth, and that the deficit has actually doubled since 2008, about 10 trillion, 20 trillion. But a member of that administration, Larry Summers, today actually went on the attack. I'm curious how you would respond to his assessment of the budget. He called it simply ludicrous, and that the administration is double counting the tax cut and the benefit from growth.
But, I did get a chance to just see the piece that Mr. Summers wrote on the way out the door. And I could, just, the ideas were rushing into my head what I might say to Larry if he were here. So if he's hiding in the back, now would be a good time for him to come out and identify himself. I went back and looked at some of the economic assumptions that the Obama administration made in its first couple of years. And I want to say on a couple of different occasions, their assumed growth rate was more than 4.5%. Keep in mind, this is the first administration in history, okay? It was the first decade, the first 8-year period in history not to have a 3% growth rate. Yet they were promising us 4.5% growth. So if Larry wants to talk about unreasonable assumptions, we talk about my 3% growth rate and his 4.5%, and we'll talk about who actually is closer to reality. Regarding the double counting, here's one of the things I think that a lot of folks have overlooked. And we did it on purpose because it's sort of hard to count this, and you don't want to make too many assumptions. You have to make assumptions about a budget. You're talking about a document that will look 10 years into the future. So it's natural for both administrations from either party to make some assumptions. But one of the assumptions we didn't make was that we didn't close any of the tax gap. For those of you who aren't familiar with that, the tax gap is the amount of money that we should collect in taxes every single year, but don't. 2016, that number is $486 billion. Almost enough to close the deficit that year. And we don't assume an additional penny of that being closed as part of our tax reform. Why is that important? There's probably two reasons that people, well, three reasons people don't want to pay tax. Number one, they just don't pay tax, and there's always a certain number of people who don't want to do that. Number two, it's just too hard for them to do it. It's too complicated for them to do it. Two reasons. Now I feel like I'm a Monty Python skit. The two reasons. And we think that, exactly, that if it's a simpler tax code, okay, that people are more likely to pay. That simply makes sense. If you can really fill out your tax returns on a single piece of paper, you're much more likely to actually do it. It's also easier for us to see if you're paying the right amount. A simpler code is easier for you to pay and easier for the government to see if you're paying the right amount, which would allow us very reasonably to assume a reduction in the tax gap. And we don't do a single penny of that. So I'm aware of the criticisms, and I would simply come back and say, look, there's other places where we were probably overly conservative in our accounting. We stand by the numbers. We thought that the assumption that the tax reform would be deficit neutral was the most reasonable of the three options that we had. We could either assume that our tax reform was deficit neutral, we could assume it would reduce the deficit, we would assume it would add to the deficit. And given the fact that we're this early in the process about dealing with tax reform, we thought that assuming that middle road was the best way to do it.